Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class from HowStuffWorks.com.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Deblina Chakraborty.
And I'm Sarah Dowdy.
And this podcast starts with a legend involving the first meeting of two men. James Murray, the primary editor of the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, and one of his most prolific contributors, a Dr. W.C. Minor. So unless you're really into dictionaries, the scenario probably doesn't interest you right off the bat until you learn that there's a bit of a mystery surrounding the situation.
So don't tune out of the podcast.
No, stay with us for just a couple minutes. So as the story goes, Murray and Minor had been working together for about 20 years, but they'd never met. Minor had kept faithfully mailing Murray information on word origins and meanings that he picked up just in the course of his own reading and research, but even though Murray had invited him several times, Minor kept refusing to make the 50-mile trip from where he was living in the small English village of Crowthorne to Oxford, where Murray's dictionary headquarters were located. So Murray, he thinks this is a little strange, but he just thought Minor's probably a little eccentric or something like that.
Maybe a shut-in or something.
Yeah. So according to this legend, in 1897, Murray finally decided, well, if this guy's not going to come to me, I'm going to go to him. And work on the dictionary was progressing well at this point, and people who'd had a hand in its creation were starting to receive honors. So Murray thought, I want to make sure Dr. Minor gets recognized too.
So he doesn't spring a surprise visit on him or anything. He telegraphs Dr. Minor and says he's planning on visiting on this certain Wednesday in November, and that he'll be taking a train that should arrive at Crowthorne Station just after 2 o'clock. So Dr. Minor wires him a response and says basically, that's great. I'll be expecting you. You'll be welcome here. And it seems like these two guys are finally going to be able to meet. Everything seems fairly normal. And it really continues to seem that way. Even when Murray arrives on the appointed day, he shows up at the train station and there's a carriage waiting for him, and it ushers him off to this huge brick mansion. Once he's inside, a servant shows up and attends him to the grand study, where there's this very important-looking man standing behind a desk, and Murray bows and announces himself to him.
He says, quote, "A very good afternoon to you, sir. I am Dr. James Murray of the London Philological Society and editor of the New English Dictionary. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to at long last make your acquaintance, for you must be, kind sir, my most assiduous helpmeet, Dr. W.C. Minor." And there's kind of an awkward pause at this point. One of those pauses where you feel like you can hear every sound in the room. And then the man responds, quote, "I regret, kind sir, I am not. It is not as all as you suppose. I am in fact the superintendent of the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Dr. Minor is most certainly here, but he is an inmate. He has been a patient here for more than 20 years.
Dun, dun, dun. It's like the beginning of a Wilkie Collins novel almost. And like we said, this account, as originally reported in the Strand magazine in 1915, is thought to be just a legend. But the two men who are involved and the circumstances surrounding them and the circumstances that would have put them in a situation like this were very real indeed.
And we're going to take a closer look at the relationship between these two men that we've talked about in part 2 of this podcast. But first, we want to look into the more pressing question that this anecdote raises, which is why most people tell it when they start talking about Dr. Minor. Who was this Dr. W.C. Minor? What was he doing in a criminal lunatic asylum? And how did a crazy person essentially become such a major contributor to the highly respected Oxford English Dictionary?
Something that just seems the ultimate of methodical, level-headed reference works you can imagine.
Right.
So this is going to be a tale of madness and murder and lexicography, but there's some war in here too. And interestingly enough, this episode kind of ties into our Civil War series in a roundabout way.
Yeah, part 1 of it at least. But before we can get into any of that, first we need to start with the basics. Who was W.C. Minor? So William Chester Minor was born in June of 1834 in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, but he was descended from a long line of Connecticut aristocrats. His parents were missionaries. His father, Eastman Minor, was a devout Congregationalist, and his mother, Lucy, the two of them together had just moved to Ceylon the year before William was born. He also had a sister whose name was also Lucy, who was born a couple years after him.
So the first really traumatic event in William Minor's life occurred when he was very, very young. Just after his 3rd birthday, his mother died of consumption. His father remarried to another missionary named Judith Taylor a few years later and started a second family with her. But according to a BBC article on Minor, he was kind of had a troubled childhood almost, and was especially tormented during his boyhood with lascivious thoughts about local girls.
Yeah, which doesn't seem that odd for a young boy, right? Especially in his preteen years, but it's a point that may have significance later when we start talking about his insanity and how it manifested itself. So just kind of keep that in the back of your brain for now. At age 14, Minor's dad had him sent back to Connecticut, and he sailed back to the United States by himself. And then he moved in with his uncle Alfred, who was a store owner in New Haven.
And about 10 years after that, Minor started school at Yale, where he specialized in comparative anatomy and earned a medical degree in February of 1863. There's also kind of an interesting side note about his time at Yale, though, especially considering his later involvement with the Oxford English Dictionary. According to an article by Joshua Kendall in The Nation, in 1861, when Minor was a first-year medical student at Yale, he signed a contract to write definitions for a new edition of Noah Webster's Dictionary, an American dictionary of the English language. And the agreement was that he'd be paid $500 to, quote, prepare the articles in the following departments: zoology, natural history, geology, mineralogy, botany, chemistry, anatomy, surgery of all sorts. Sounds like kind of a monumental undertaking, especially for a first-year medical student who's probably busy with other things.
Yeah.
I would think so. But Minor got this job because James Dana, who was a professor at Yale and was originally supposed to write these selections or these sections of the new dictionary, had to lighten up his workload a bit because he was experiencing a bout of depression. So Dana suggested, kind of randomly it seems, a first-year med student, Minor, to stand in for him and cover the sections, and Dana, being more experienced, would still supervise or at least review the completed work.
Apparently, though, he didn't supervise him that closely because, according to Kendall's article, the sections Minor worked on contained many inaccuracies and inconsistencies. His work was publicly criticized, which must have been mortifying for a young med student, especially by Samuel Stamen Haldeman of Delaware College, who later became one of the first presidents of the American Philological Association. He later wrote that, quote, "Excepting Professor Dana's part, the natural history is the, quote, weakest part of the book."
Burn.
Yeah, totally. Regardless, Minor had his first experience working on a dictionary under his belt, and his name was in that 1864 edition of Webster's.
And of course, he also had his medical degree, too. And so after graduating from Yale, Minor joined the Union Army. And his first posting was at the Knight Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut. And he was basically still training there, still getting his experience as a doctor. But the Civil War was going on. So a few months to a year after entering this first posting, he ended up on the battlefront in Virginia, where he served as an assistant surgeon. Now, Minor wasn't really the best soldier you could imagine. He wasn't exactly cut out for the horrors of war. Most people describe him as being pretty sensitive, refined. He liked to read. He enjoyed painting watercolors. He played the flute. And so it's really unfortunate then, considering the battle he ended up in.
Yeah, he ended up at the Battle of the Wilderness, which is described as a particularly bloody and horrific battle. I've seen it described as a slaughterhouse. The battle lasted 50 hours, but it left 25,000 dead or wounded. It started when General Grant's men crossed the Rapidan River, and apparently the rifle fire was so thick it not only killed people but could cut off trees. It also started a fire in the underbrush so that not only were men being killed and wounded by gunfire, they were also being burned to death. One soldier wrote later that it was like, quote, "Hell had itself usurped the place of earth."
And the key thing here as it relates to Minor, though, is that